The courtroom fell into a silence so profound that even breathing seemed forbidden when Victoria Ashford Sterling walked through those heavy oak doors with a smile that could cut glass. If you're ready to witness true justice unfold, hit that like button right now. The air inside courtroom 7B carried that particular heaviness that only comes when something monumental is about to happen. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches where over 100 spectators sat packed shoulder to shoulder. The scent of old wood and floor polish mixed with the nervous energy of anticipation. This wasn't just another case. This was the trial everyone had been talking about for months. The trial of Victoria Ashford Sterling, the 28-year-old heiress whose family name adorned buildings across 3 states and whose trust fund could buy a small island. Victoria moved through the courtroom like she owned it, which, given her family's donations to various civic projects over the years, wasn't entirely inaccurate in her mind. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the hardwood floor with deliberate precision, each step a small declaration of superiority. She wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than most people in that room, made in 6 months. Tailored so perfectly, it looked painted on. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, diamond earrings catching the light with every turn of her head. Her face, beautiful in that carefully maintained way that money could buy, held an expression of mild amusement, as if she'd accidentally wandered into a particularly dull theater production. Behind her walked her legal team, 3 attorneys from Pemberton, Whitmore and Associates, the most expensive defense firm in the state. The lead attorney, Marcus Whitmore himself, was a silver-haired man in his 50s who'd never lost a case involving clients with 8-figure net worths. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how the game was played and had all the right pieces in all the right places. On the other side of the aisle, at the prosecution table, sat District Attorney Rebecca Chen, a woman in her early 40s whose reputation for tenacity had earned her both respect and enemies in equal measure. Next to her sat 2 assistant DAs, both with folders thick enough to stop a bullet. Behind them, in the front row of the gallery, sat the Reeves family, Thomas Reeves, his wife Maria, and their 2 teenage children. Thomas wore his only suit, pressed carefully but showing its age at the cuffs. His hands were calloused from years of construction work. Maria's eyes were red-rimmed, a tissue clutched in her hand. Their children sat rigid, trying to be brave. The charges against Victoria Ashford Sterling were serious. Vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident, and attempting to obstruct justice. 6 months earlier, on a warm September evening, Victoria had left an exclusive nightclub in her Mercedes-AMG GT after what witnesses described as considerable drinking. She'd been racing down Riverside Boulevard at nearly 90 miles per hour when she ran a red light and struck another vehicle, a 15-year-old Honda Civic driven by 21-year-old Marcus Reeves, the eldest son of Thomas and Maria, a college student working part-time to help pay his tuition. Marcus Reeves had died at the scene. He never had a chance. Victoria had fled, leaving her demolished Mercedes 2 blocks away and calling her family attorney before she called anyone else. By the time police located her 4 hours later at her family's estate, she'd showered, changed clothes, and had her attorneys present. Her blood alcohol content couldn't be tested. Security footage from the nightclub mysteriously corrupted. Witnesses suddenly became uncertain about what they'd seen, but Rebecca Chen was patient, methodical, and relentless. She'd spent 6 months building a case from phone records, traffic cameras 3 blocks away, paint transfer evidence, mechanical analysis, testimony from the nightclub's valet, and a partial footprint at the scene that matched a pair of Giuseppe Zanotti heels found in Victoria's closet. Heels with microscopic glass fragments embedded in the sole that matched the shattered windshield of the Civic. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Elias Monroe presiding. Every person in that courtroom stood as one, and the door behind the bench opened. Judge Elias Monroe entered with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that justice could not be rushed. He was in his mid-60s, with steel-grey hair and a face carved by years of witnessing humanity at its worst and occasionally its best. His black robe hung on a frame that suggested he'd once been an athlete, now refined into something more solid, more permanent. But it was his eyes that held everyone's attention, dark, penetrating, missing nothing. Eyes that had seen through 1,000 lies, 1,000 performances, 1,000 people who thought they were cleverer than the law. He settled into his chair with a slight creak of leather, surveyed the courtroom with that patient, all-seeing gaze, and spoke in a voice like distant thunder. "Be seated." The collective sound of 100 people sitting down filled the room, followed by that thick silence again. Judge Monroe opened the file before him, though everyone suspected he already knew every word on every page. He looked up at Victoria Ashford Sterling, who met his gaze with something that might have been a smile or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell which. "Ms. Ashford Sterling," Judge Monroe said, his voice even and measured, "you stand accused of vehicular manslaughter while operating under the influence of alcohol, leaving the scene of a fatal accident and attempting to obstruct justice in the subsequent investigation. How do you plead?" Victoria stood, and for a moment the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Whitmore rose beside her, but Victoria placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that said, "I've got this." Her voice, when she spoke, carried the casual confidence of someone ordering at a restaurant. "Not guilty, Your Honor. Absolutely not guilty." The way she said it, with that slight emphasis on absolutely, with that tiny upward curl at the corner of her mouth, sent a ripple through the courtroom. It wasn't just a plea, it was a dismissal. It said, "This whole proceeding is beneath me." Judge Monroe's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once, made a note, and said, "Jury selection will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bail conditions remain in effect. This court is adjourned until that time." His gavel came down with a sharp crack that felt like punctuation on a sentence that hadn't finished being written. Over the next 3 weeks, the trial proceeded with the careful grinding machinery of the legal system. Jury selection took 4 days. 12 citizens who would decide Victoria's fate, carefully vetted by both sides, each attorney using their challenges and acceptances like chess moves. The jury that emerged was diverse. A retired teacher, a mechanic, a nurse, an accountant, a store manager, a software engineer, a homemaker, a postal worker, a restaurant owner, a librarian, a plumber, and a social worker. Ordinary people called to perform an extraordinary duty. The prosecution built its case brick by methodical brick. Rebecca Chen was surgical in her precision, never overreaching, always letting the evidence speak. She brought in the traffic camera footage from 3 blocks away, showing a silver Mercedes matching Victoria's license plate, speeding through an intersection 60 seconds before the estimated time of impact. She brought in the mechanical expert who testified about the damage patterns on both vehicles, demonstrating with computer simulations how Victoria's Mercedes had run the red light at approximately 87 miles per hour, striking the driver's side of Marcus Reeves's Civic with catastrophic force. She brought in the paint transfer evidence, silver metallic paint from Victoria's Mercedes found embedded in the Civic's crumpled frame, and red paint from the Civic found on Victoria's front bumper. She brought in the valet from the nightclub, a young man named Carlos Mendez, who testified in halting English that he'd watched Ms. Ashford Sterling stumble slightly, getting into her car, that she'd dropped her keys twice, that he'd offered to call her a car service, and she'd laughed at him and told him to worry about people who actually need help. She brought in the forensic analyst who'd examined the Giuseppe Zanotti heels, showing the jury enlarged photographs of the microscopic glass fragments, glass that chemically matched the windshield of Marcus Reeves's Honda Civic. She brought in the cell phone records, showing that Victoria's first call after the accident wasn't to 911, wasn't to check if anyone was hurt, but to Marcus Whitmore, her family attorney, at 11:47 p.m., a call that lasted 7 minutes, and she brought in the Reeves family. Thomas Reeves took the stand in his pressed suit, his voice breaking as he described his son. Marcus had been studying engineering at the State University. He'd been working part-time at a hardware store to help with expenses, even though his parents told him to focus on his studies. He'd been driving home from his shift when Victoria's Mercedes had ended his life at a red light on Riverside Boulevard. "My son had a future," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire courtroom. He wanted to design bridges. He used to say he wanted to build things that would last, that would help people. He was 21 years old. He was a good boy. He was a good son. Maria Reeves couldn't speak through her tears. She simply held up a photograph, Marcus in his graduation gown, smiling at the camera with his whole life ahead of him. Throughout all of this, Victoria sat at the defense table with an expression of polite boredom. She checked her manicured nails. She whispered comments to her attorneys that occasionally made her smile. She sighed audibly during particularly emotional testimony. Once, when Maria Reeves broke down crying on the stand, Victoria rolled her eyes in a gesture so quick and so dismissive that only those sitting closest to the defense table caught it. But the court sketch artist caught it, and that sketch would make the evening news. The defense's strategy became clear as Marcus Whitmore called his witnesses. Reasonable doubt, alternative explanations, questions about evidence chain of custody, expert witnesses who suggested the accident reconstruction might have been flawed, that perhaps Marcus Reeves had been the one speeding, that perhaps the impact dynamics weren't as clear-cut as the prosecution claimed. Character witnesses who described Victoria as charitable, community-minded, and incapable of such recklessness. Wealthy friends who'd attended the same private schools and country clubs, who testified in designer suits about Victoria's donations to various causes and her gentle nature. Marcus Whitmore was good at his job. He planted seeds of doubt, raised questions, suggested alternative narratives. He never quite accused the prosecution of misconduct, but he implied it. He never quite said Marcus Reeves had caused his own death, but he suggested it was possible. He painted Victoria as a young woman being persecuted because of her family's wealth, a victim of circumstantial evidence and public prejudice. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marcus Whitmore called Victoria Ashford Sterling to the stand. She walked to the witness box like she was walking onto a yacht, graceful, unhurried, faintly amused by the whole proceeding. She wore a navy blue dress, more conservative than her usual style, with a single strand of pearls. Her makeup was subtle, her hair down around her shoulders. The transformation from heiress to innocent defendant was calculated and obvious to anyone paying attention. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, with the same tone someone might use to agree that yes, it looked like rain later. Marcus Whitmore led her through her testimony with the practiced ease of a man conducting a symphony he'd written himself. Victoria described her evening at the nightclub. Yes, she'd had a few drinks, but she was absolutely certain she was under the legal limit. She was always careful about such things. She described leaving the club around 11:30 p.m., driving toward her family's estate, taking her usual route down Riverside Boulevard. "And then what happened?" Whitmore asked. Victoria's eyes welled up on cue. "I saw something dart into the road. An animal, I think. A deer, maybe. Or a large dog. I swerved to avoid it, and when I straightened out, I heard a terrible sound behind me. At first, I thought maybe I'd hit whatever was in the road, but I was frightened and disoriented. I drove for another block or so before I pulled over, and that's when I realized something serious might have happened. I was in shock. I called Mr. Whitmore because I didn't know what to do. And why didn't you call 911? I was panicking. I wasn't thinking clearly. I know now that I should have, and I regret that every single day, but I genuinely didn't realize the severity of what had occurred." It was a good performance, well rehearsed, delivered with just enough tremor in her voice to seem genuine without being overdone. The jury watched her carefully, their faces unreadable. Then Rebecca Chen stood for cross-examination, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Ms. Ashford Sterling," Chen began, her voice pleasant, almost conversational, "you testified that you had a few drinks at the nightclub that evening. How many drinks specifically?" "I'm not sure. 3, maybe 4. "Over what period of time?" "A few hours." "The club's bar records show you were served 7 vodka cocktails between 9 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. Does that refresh your recollection?" Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If that's what the records show, you also testified that you pulled over a block or so after hearing the sound. Your Mercedes was found abandoned 2.3 miles from the accident scene. Would you like to revise that testimony?" "I was disoriented. I didn't measure the distance." "You were disoriented enough to not know how far you drove, but clear-headed enough to call your attorney instead of emergency services." "I was in shock." "In shock, but still capable of driving 2.3 miles, parking your vehicle, walking home, showering, and changing your clothes before police arrived?" Marcus Whitmore stood. "Objection. Argumentative." Judge Monroe's voice was flat. "Overruled. Answer the question, Ms. Ashford Sterling." Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "I've explained what happened. I made mistakes because I was frightened and confused." Rebecca Chen picked up a photograph from her table. The shoes, the Giuseppe Zanottis with their distinctive red soles. "Do you recognize these shoes?" "They're mine." "When did you last wear them?" "I don't recall specifically." "The nightclub has a dress code requiring heels. Security footage shows you entering the club at 8:47 p.m. wearing heels with red soles. Are these the shoes you wore that evening?" Victoria hesitated for the first time. "Possibly." "These shoes were found in your closet by investigators. Embedded in the sole are glass fragments that forensically match the windshield of Marcus Reeves's vehicle. The prosecution has established that you were wearing these shoes when you fled your vehicle at the scene. You ran from the car, stepping on broken glass, and then disposed of the shoes in your closet thinking no one would check. Isn't that the truth?" "That's speculation." "You didn't answer my question. Did you or did you not run from your vehicle after killing Marcus Reeves, stepping on broken glass in the process?" Victoria's face flushed. For the first time, anger broke through the careful facade. "I didn't kill anyone. It was an accident, a tragic accident. An accident you left. A young man died on that road while you showered and changed clothes. His parents waited at the hospital for news while you consulted with your attorney about how to avoid responsibility. Marcus Reeves bled to death in a car seat while you were concerned about your legal exposure. That's not an accident, Ms. Ashford Sterling. That's cowardice." "Objection!" Marcus Whitmore was on his feet. "Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness." Judge Monroe looked at Rebecca Chen for a long moment, then at Victoria. "Sustained. Rephrase, Ms. Chen." But the damage was done. Victoria's mask had slipped. Her face was red, her breathing rapid, her hands gripping the arms of the witness chair. When she spoke again, her voice had lost that cultivated softness. "You think you understand? You have no idea what it's like to have every mistake scrutinized, to have people hate you just because of who your family is. I made an error in judgment. That's all. One error. Everyone makes them. Marcus Reeves won't get the chance to make any more errors, will he?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Victoria stared at Rebecca Chen with open hatred, and in that moment, every person in the jury box saw exactly who Victoria Ashford Sterling really was. Not the polished, charitable socialite from the character witnesses, but someone who viewed the death of a young man as an inconvenience, a public relations problem, something that had happened to her rather than something she had caused. The prosecution rested. The defense rested. Closing arguments were delivered. Marcus Whitmore's elegant appeal to reasonable doubt, Rebecca Chen's methodical recap of overwhelming evidence. The jury retired to deliberate on a Thursday afternoon at 3:15 p.m. They returned on Friday morning at 10:42 a.m. 19 hours of deliberation. The courtroom was even more packed than before, if that were possible. People stood in the back, lined the walls. The Reeves family sat in the front row, holding hands, barely breathing. Victoria sat at the defense table, her confidence seemingly restored after a night's sleep, her cream suit back on, her expression one of mild anticipation, as if waiting for a restaurant reservation to be confirmed. Judge Monroe entered. Everyone rose, everyone sat. The silence pressed down like a physical weight as the jury reached a verdict. The foreperson, the retired teacher, stood. She was a woman in her 60s with grey hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her voice was steady. "We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the count of vehicular manslaughter while operating under the influence of alcohol, we find the defendant guilty." A sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Victoria's face went white. Marcus Whitmore closed his eyes. "On the count of leaving the scene of a fatal accident, we find the defendant guilty." Maria Reeves let out a sob. Thomas held her tighter. "On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." For a moment, Victoria just stared at the jury box as if they'd spoken in a foreign language. Then she turned to Marcus Whitmore. "Fix this," she hissed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "My family pays you an obscene amount of money. Fix this now." Judge Monroe's voice cut through the murmur like a blade. "Order. The defendant will remain silent." Victoria spun toward him, and whatever control she'd maintained shattered. "This is ridiculous. This whole trial has been a circus from the beginning. That jury doesn't understand. They can't possibly understand." "Ms. Ashford Sterling, you will sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt." "Contempt?" Victoria's voice rose, shrill and furious. "Contempt? Do you have any idea who my family is? Do you know how much money we've contributed to this city? My grandfather's name is on the hospital wing. My father funds half the charitable organizations in this state. And you're going to let these people," she gestured wildly at the jury, "these random people who probably can't even balance their own checkbooks, decide my future?" The courtroom erupted. Judge Monroe's gavel came down once, twice, 3 times, each crack like a gunshot. "Order! Order in this court!" But Victoria wasn't finished. The mask was off, the performance over. "This is persecution, pure and simple. It was an accident, a tragic accident, yes, but accidents happen every day. People die every day. It's unfortunate, but it's not my fault that some kid was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I have a life. I have plans. I have a future. You can't just throw that away because a bunch of people decided they hate me for having what they don't." The silence that followed was so complete, it rang in the ears. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Judge Monroe. His face could have been carved from granite. He looked at Victoria Ashford Sterling with an expression that wasn't anger. Anger would have been too hot, too immediate. This was something colder, something that had been forged over decades of watching people like her treat the court, the law, and human life itself as inconveniences to be managed. He spoke quietly, which somehow made his words carry more weight than if he'd shouted. "Ms. Ashford Sterling, in my 34 years on the bench, I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen criminals, victims, heroes, and cowards. I have witnessed profound remorse and calculated manipulation. I have heard every excuse, every justification, every rationalization that the human mind can construct to avoid accountability. But I must tell you, in all those years, I have rarely, very rarely encountered someone who has demonstrated such a profound and complete absence of basic human empathy as you have displayed in this courtroom." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Monroe raised a single finger and she fell silent. "You stand here, convicted by a jury of your peers of killing a young man through your reckless disregard for the law and the lives of others, And your primary concern is not for the life you took, not for the family you destroyed, but for the inconvenience this verdict represents to your plans. You have shown no remorse. You have offered no genuine apology. You have not shed one authentic tear for Marcus Reeves. Instead, you have treated these proceedings as an annoyance, an obstacle, something to be overcome through expensive attorneys and family connections. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Victoria's. You said that Marcus Reeves was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let me correct you. Marcus Reeves was in exactly the right place. He was driving home from work. He was stopped at a red light, obeying the law, doing everything a responsible citizen should do. It was you, Ms. Ashford Sterling, who was in the wrong place. It was you who made the choice to drink excessively. It was you who made the choice to drive. It was you who made the choice to speed. It was you who ran a red light. It was you who killed an innocent young man. And it was you who made the choice to flee, to hide, to obstruct justice, and to use your family's resources to avoid accountability. The courtroom was so still that the distant sound of traffic outside seemed loud in comparison. You invoked your family's contributions to this city as if wealth and philanthropy purchase immunity from consequence. Let me be abundantly clear. They do not. This courtroom does not recognize social status. This courtroom does not recognize family names. This courtroom does not recognize net worth. This courtroom recognizes only two things: the truth and the law. The jury has determined the truth. It is now my duty to apply the law. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over everyone present. Victoria had gone from red to pale, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge of the defense table. However, before I proceed to sentencing, I want to address something you said. You claimed these jurors can't balance their own checkbooks and questioned their right to judge you. These 12 citizens have given 3 weeks of their lives to carefully consider the evidence in this case. They have listened to every testimony, examined every photograph, weighed every argument. They have performed the most essential duty of citizenship, participating in the administration of justice. And you dare to demean them because they don't come from your social class? Because they don't vacation where you vacation or shop where you shop? Judge Monroe glanced at the jury box, where 12 ordinary people sat with expressions ranging from anger to sadness to grim satisfaction. I want the jury to know that this court holds them in the highest respect. They have performed admirably, and their verdict is supported by overwhelming evidence. They have nothing to apologize for and everything to be proud of. He turned back to Victoria. Sentencing will take place 1 week from today. Until that time, the defendant is remanded into custody. Bail is revoked. Victoria's face registered shock, then panic. What? No, you can't. I can and I have, bailiff. 2 bailiffs approached the defense table. Marcus Whitmore stood quickly. Your Honor, if I may, my client has complied with all bail conditions. Your client has just demonstrated a profound contempt for this court and a complete lack of respect for the legal process. She has shown that she believes herself above the law. I will not risk her using her considerable resources to flee this jurisdiction before sentencing. She will remain in custody. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with absolute finality. As the bailiffs approached Victoria, she looked around wildly as if expecting someone to stop this, to intervene, to make it all go away the way problems had always gone away for her. But no one moved. Her father, sitting in the back of the courtroom, looked away. Her mother covered her face with her hands. "Get your hands off me," Victoria said as the first bailiff reached for her arm. "Don't touch me. Do you know who I am?" The bailiff, a woman in her 40s who'd been doing this job for 20 years, said calmly, "Ma'am, please place your hands behind your back." I will not be treated like some common criminal. This is insane. This is..." The second bailiff, seeing this was about to escalate, stepped forward. Between them, they guided Victoria's arms behind her back and secured the handcuffs. The click of the metal was loud in the silent courtroom. Victoria's face crumpled, not with remorse, but with the disbelief of someone confronting a reality they'd never imagined possible. As they led her toward the side door that would take her to holding cells, she twisted back toward Judge Monroe, her voice breaking. "You'll regret this. My family will make sure of it. You have no idea the kind of pressure they can bring to bear." Judge Monroe looked at her with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so deeply tired. "The only regret I have, Ms. Ashford Sterling, is that the law limits what I can do to balance the scales of justice. Take her out." The door closed behind her, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like the end of a chapter. 1 week later, the courtroom filled again for sentencing. Victoria, now wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of designer suits, looked diminished somehow, smaller, the week in county lockup having stripped away the last layers of pretense. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry, no mask to hide behind. Judge Monroe entered and the ritual repeated. All rise, be seated. Silence like a held breath. The court has reviewed the pre-sentencing report, victim impact statements, and letters submitted on behalf of both the victim's family and the defendant. Ms. Ashford Sterling, do you wish to make a statement before I impose sentence? Victoria stood. Marcus Whitmore stood beside her, his hand hovering near her elbow as if to steady her or catch her if she fell. For a long moment, she just stood there, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, something like genuine emotion crossed her face. But when she spoke, her words were clearly scripted, rehearsed, delivered with the flat effect of someone reading a statement they don't believe. "Your Honor, I want to say that I'm sorry for what happened. I know that Marcus Reeves's family is suffering, and I take responsibility for my role in this tragedy. I hope that in time they can find it in their hearts to forgive me." It was empty, hollow, the kind of apology written by attorneys and vetted by publicists. Judge Monroe looked at her for a long moment, then at Thomas and Maria Reeves, who sat holding each other, tears streaming down both their faces. "Ms. Ashford Sterling, the court has no doubt that you regret the position you now find yourself in. However, regret for consequences is not the same as remorse for actions. True remorse requires empathy, requires the ability to understand and feel the pain you have caused others. I have seen no evidence of that capacity in you." He opened the file before him, though again everyone knew he didn't need to read it. "On the count of vehicular manslaughter while operating under the influence, the maximum sentence is 20 years. On the count of leaving the scene of a fatal accident, the maximum sentence is 10 years. On the count of obstruction of justice, the maximum sentence is 5 years. These sentences may run concurrently or consecutively at the court's discretion." The courtroom held its collective breath. "I have considered all factors in mitigation: your age, your lack of prior criminal record, the letters submitted on your behalf. However, I must balance those factors against the severity of your actions, your complete lack of remorse, your attempt to use wealth and privilege to evade responsibility, and your demonstrated contempt for this court and the rule of law." Judge Monroe paused, his eyes moving from the file to Victoria's face. "It is the judgment of this court that on count 1, vehicular manslaughter while operating under the influence, you are sentenced to 18 years in state prison. On count 2, leaving the scene of a fatal accident, you are sentenced to 8 years in state prison. On count 3, obstruction of justice, you are sentenced to 4 years in state prison. These sentences will run consecutively for a total of 30 years in state prison." The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. Marcus Whitmore's face went slack with shock. Victoria's mother let out a wail from the back of the room. Thomas Reeves closed his eyes and pulled his wife closer. But Victoria herself just stood there frozen, as if her brain couldn't process what she'd just heard. 30 years! Her voice came out as barely a whisper. That's my entire life." "No, Ms. Ashford Sterling, that's 30 years of your life. Marcus Reeves lost all of his life. He lost every birthday, every graduation, every career achievement, every marriage, every child, every moment of joy and sadness and everything in between. He lost the bridge he'll never design, the family he'll never raise, the old age he'll never reach. You have taken everything from him and from his family. This sentence doesn't balance that loss. Nothing could, but it acknowledges that your actions were not a simple mistake or an unfortunate accident. They were the result of a series of choices, each one more selfish and more destructive than the last. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly. You will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years, provided you demonstrate genuine rehabilitation and remorse. I strongly encourage you to use your time in prison to develop the capacity for empathy you have so conspicuously lacked. Perhaps if you serve your sentence with humility and genuine effort at self-improvement, you may one day become the person you pretended to be in this courtroom, someone worthy of forgiveness. He straightened. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to the Reeves family in the amount of $500,000 for funeral expenses, lost future income, and emotional damages. Your driver's license is permanently revoked. Upon release, you will be subject to 5 years of supervised probation. The gavel came down. This court is adjourned. As the bailiffs approached Victoria once more, she finally seemed to fully grasp what had happened. Her legs buckled, and Marcus Whitmore caught her. "No," she said, her voice rising. "No, no, no, this isn't happening. This can't be happening. 30 years. I'll be 58 years old. My life will be over. You can't do this to me." The bailiffs helped her to her feet, and this time she didn't resist. She looked back at her parents one last time, her face stricken with the belated realization that money couldn't buy her way out of this, that privilege had its limits, that some consequences couldn't be avoided. Her father met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. Her mother sobbed into her hands. As Victoria was led out of the courtroom for the last time, Thomas Reeves stood. His voice cut through the chaos, quiet but firm. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for seeing my son. Thank you for making her see him too." Judge Monroe nodded once, his expression softening for just a moment. "The court sees all victims, Mr. Reeves. Always." In the days and weeks that followed, the story of Victoria Ashford Sterling's trial and sentencing spread far beyond that courtroom. It became a case study in law schools, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the scales of justice, when properly balanced, recognize neither wealth nor poverty, neither privilege nor disadvantage, only truth, only law, only the fundamental principle that every human life has equal value. Victoria Ashford Sterling is currently serving her sentence at a medium-security women's correctional facility. According to reports, she works in the prison library and has enrolled in educational programs. Whether she has found the capacity for genuine remorse remains to be seen. But in courtroom 7B, on that autumn morning when Judge Elias Monroe delivered his sentence, justice was served. Not perfectly, because perfect justice may not be possible in an imperfect world, but as well as the law allows and human judgment permits. The law does not care about your last name, your bank account, or the buildings that bear your family's inscription. The law cares only about what you did, why you did it, and whether you understand the magnitude of the harm you caused. In that courtroom, Victoria Ashford Sterling learned what everyone must eventually learn: that privilege is not armor, that wealth cannot buy absolution, and that when you stand before justice, you stand alone with the consequences of your choices. If this story moved you, if you believe in a justice system that treats everyone equally regardless of their bank account, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment saying "Justice for All," or letting us know where you're watching from, because these stories matter, these lessons matter, and reminding ourselves that accountability applies to everyone, always, is how we build a society worthy of the word justice.